I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we will talk Harris and Trump respective policies on trade and other economic issues. Plus, we'll talk about the proposed bans on Chinese and Russian vehicle technology, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, I'm back. As you know, I've been spending the first 3 weeks of the NFL season researching why the Ravens suck and better understanding why the Browns suck. And so
it took you 3 weeks to figure that out?
Yes, it took 3 weeks, and I've missed you guys terribly. You've had great guests, but it is good to be back.
I have no comment about the Carolina Panthers.
No comment. Although, hey, looking up with Andy Dalton there, so, could be really interesting. Guys, but we need to talk about what everybody's talking about and what is saturating everyone's newsfeed right now. Harris and Trump's economic policy proposals. What are the key differences between their economic plans as we know them? Scott, let's go to you first.
Sure. As I've characterized the race for some time, former President Trump is trying to do what only Grover Cleveland has done, which is to have 2 non-consecutive terms. If he were to win, I think overall, Trump 2.0 would look a lot like what we experienced in the 4 years of Trump 1.0. So that's actually a decent place for policy analysis.
So it's sort of like Tariff Man returns.
Yes, and Tariff Man really never left.
Yeah.
Oddly, Tariff Man made his impact in his 4-year term, and then President Biden actually applied more tariffs on more entities, more economies at higher rates. And they never really unwound any of the Trump tariffs.
Tariff Man's reach is far. There is no question about it.
It's amazing. However, I think there's something going on in their policy proposals that bears discussion beyond tariffs, and it has to do with international trade because it deals with competitiveness. Now, first, it's not a surprise that both campaigns are focused on manufacturing, mostly because the path to victory runs through Wisconsin, Michigan, and most importantly, Pennsylvania for both campaigns. There are swing states in the Sun Belt, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, even North Carolina, where I'm sitting. But those industrial heartland states are the key to election. Manufacturing is the history in those states, and a comeback in manufacturing makes for something that people respect, and it's an important issue to voters. So that's why they're both talking about it. And I do think there is a real contrast in industrial competitiveness. And that affects both your export competitiveness and it affects the plans that both candidates say they want to accomplish of bringing jobs back to America. Now, when you make plant location decisions, manufacturing location decisions, there are a lot of things you don't control. You don't control where your customers are. You don't control where your suppliers are. But I've identified 3 factors that have a lot of federal influence and really matter for location and competitiveness. And those are energy, regulation, and tax rates, taxation. What you have with Donald Trump is a commitment to low energy costs. And he says on day one, it's drill, baby, drill. What I think he's mostly proposing from the specific documents has to do with natural gas and electric power, both of which having low price natural gas available both to generate electricity and for the manufacturing process is vitally important. On regulation, the person I follow most closely on regulation is Casey Mulligan of the University of Chicago. And as a comparison, in the 4 years of Donald Trump, Casey Mulligan calculates that the lifetime impact on Trump's deregulation would be $11,000 per household over their lifetime. The 4 years or 3.5 years of the Biden administration's regulation added a lifetime cost of $47,000. So it's a lifetime cost per household of $50,000 difference. Trump deregulated, drove regulation costs down. The Biden administration, mostly through the pursuit of net zero, drove them up by about $50,000 over the lifetime of the regulation per household. So that's what they say. Also, there's a big difference in tax policy. That with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the marginal tax rate, the highest headline tax rate in the United States for corporations is 21%. That is essentially the OECD average. The Harris campaign proposes a 28% tax rate, and they appear to be ready to let the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire in 2025, which would increase taxes, particularly on small businesses, because of some provisions of that law that would expire. And on energy, of course, while you have the rapid pursuit of lower costs in the Trump dream or the Trump policy, both the Biden administration and Vice President Harris seem committed to net zero 2030. They haven't undermined yet. Net zero 2030 requires higher energy costs. So I think when you look at what would cause manufacturers and companies to make decisions to locate plants in the United States, it looks to me like while the tariffs will be a headache and will cause less predictability, that the Biden/Harris approach, it looks like Germany. And Germany right now is deindustrializing, by the way. They wound up with higher energy costs by policy. The energy costs got worse when the cheap Russian gas was cut off in the Ukraine conflict, and they have a very high regulation environment. And so industrial companies are leaving Germany. Many of them are relocated in the United States. So while that's not a holistic look, industrial competitiveness, I would say, advantage to the Trump policy versus the Harris policy.
Well, Dankeschön, Scott. And over to you, Bill. What do you think about all this?
Well, he's left so many things out, I don't know where to start.
Here we go.
Go for it.
And it will surprise nobody to hear that I'm more negative about Trump on this stuff. I mean, I can't give a full litany of all this. Let me approach it from kind of a slightly different direction. Both of them are emphasizing manufacturing, and both of them are emphasizing, for lack of a better term, what I would call old manufacturing, meaning steel, aluminum, the traditional stuff. This is why as I said before, I did my column on Lost in the 50s tonight. They're both back there. There's a difference, though, and that is that unlike Trump, Harris also talks about new manufacturing, and he doesn't. But she talks about semiconductors. She talks about quantum computing. She talks about biotechnology. She talks about the industries of the future. That's not insignificant in all this. And in addition, what else? A blockchain, she mentioned in her most recent speech, other emerging technologies, as well as batteries and other, advanced energy technologies. So one difference is fundamentally, one is looking to recover the past, and one is also looking to recover the past, which I think certainly for Harris and probably also for Trump is a political judgment, because the past is really a big deal in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. So you have to do that. But I think Harris is also focusing on what the economy is going to look like 15, 20, 10 years from now, and what kind of industries we need to be competitive going forward. And Trump is not. The other difference that I've noticed is the proportion of sticks and carrots. They both have some carrots, mostly tax carrots of various sorts. In fact, Harris only really has carrots. Trump's got a really big stick, which I think Scott is undersold here or underrated, and that's his tariffs. And he's talking about tariffs that would be not only prohibitive, I think, but irrational. There doesn't seem to be much debate, except in Trump's mind, that Americans end up paying the bulk of the cost of the tariffs. Various organizations have evaluated what the effect of his proposals would be. His proposals keep changing, so it's hard to pin down the value, but I think the largest number was $3,900 per family. So it's not cheap. But I think the other thing to keep in mind, actually, about both of them is that if you want to bring back old manufacturing, you need to really think about that carefully in terms of what you're getting into. Manufacturing didn't just pick up and leave because a bunch of executives decided that they wanted to do that. There were economic factors involved as well. And the biggest one was cost. The cost elements that have caused the departure of manufacturing jobs over decades. This is not something that happened, in the last 4 years. This is something that's been going on for 50 years. The cost elements really haven't changed. One of the little things that came out the other day that fascinated me was our good friend Ed Gresser, who's been on the podcast in the past, little thing about toasters. Because one of the things that Trump has said is, he's attacked GE for selling its appliance unit to.
He doesn't like toasters?
He doesn't like foreign toasters.
Okay.
He likes good American toasters.
I understand that.
But Ed's point is, if you want a good American toaster, it'll cost you $300. And if you want a Chinese toaster, it'll be somewhere between $15 and $40. So which would you pick, Andrew? The $300 toaster?
I'm American all the way, Bill. I buy American.
So, all right, more power to you. And I hope you enjoy your $300 toaster.
I do. I actually have a $300 toaster, I believe. I did not buy it. My wife did. And it toasts bagels really well. I don't know if Chinese toasters really understand bagels, but that's a whole other podcast.
What?
If I could momentarily speak for the outside the Beltway crowd, because I became one.
Yeah.
The last couple of years, I moved to the South, moved to the Sun Belt, moved away from Washington, and there's a lot of Trump supporters down here. Okay, and I talked to some of them. And here's something that I didn't see when I was in Washington. And believe me, I was a critic of President Trump when he was in office, particularly his day-to-day management of the politics of Washington. I thought was really mostly awful and kept him from accomplishing what he wanted to do. But the thing is, one of the appreciations for Trump in this part of the world is that he's not a politician. And if you look at him as an agent for your interests or the American people's interests, one who's kind of obnoxious and thinks out loud and says a lot of things that wind up just being, not real policies. He's not polished like a politician. He's more like hiring an agent to do your work for us. And sometimes, you get into tough negotiations, you want an agent who's an SOB. That's his character in this campaign. Meanwhile, Bill's correctly pointing out that Vice President Harris is doing a masterful political job of, first of all, of not taking any account of what's happened in the last 3.5 years. She's managed to distance herself from the administrations she's part of, which is a real skill. Okay, but they're different in the way they make their pronouncements. I didn't see that till I moved outside. I would also point out, and Bill, I'd like to know your point of view on this, which is we really have a couple years data on the, sort of since the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. We have some measures of how the industrial policy approach is working. And the answer is not well. If you look at the Institute for Supply Management's Purchasing Manager Index, manufacturing has been in a contraction since 2022. If you look at sector specific, the subsidies have created about 8,800 new jobs in battery manufacturing, but the regulation has cost 10,000 or more jobs in oil and gas. So the net is manufacturing output and employment is pretty static despite the heavy emphasis of federal support through either subsidies or regulation. I think she wants to do more of that. If I read the policy paper correctly, she wants to do more of that. And I'm not sure what to think about that. But Bill, I know you have a point of view.
Well, I can help
Bill
you.
Bill definitely has a point of view on this one.
I can help you on that. The factoid I remember from the various discussions of the speeches that both of them gave this week is that if you measure it from the standpoint of inbound investment, they both say they want to attract more investment, more manufacturing here. There has been more inbound investment in the Biden administration by around, I think, more than $100 billion than there was in the entire Trump administration. On the whole, I think it's too early to say how the industrial policy initiatives of Biden are going to turn out. It takes a while to build factories. It takes a while to hire people. We're just in the beginning. And, there's going to be some successes. There are also going to be some failures. I guess I would say two things, though. One, I've tried to avoid, at least on this episode, getting into Trump's personality. So I'm not going to take the bait on whether he's a nice person or not. But I think that it's
Nobody's saying that, Bill.
I know you didn't say that, but I'm not going to take the bait and say it too. But I am going to say that I think we're all entitled to measure him based on the sanity of his proposals. And if you're making proposals that just are irrational, you need to be held accountable for that. Low-end manufacturing is not going to be viable in the United States. And he can talk all he wants about giving people tax credits to bring toasters back here or to bring other kinds of industries back here. We are a high-cost manufacturer. And those are not industries where high-cost manufacturing is going to be competitive. On top of that, as we've said many times in this podcast, and I think agreed, we don't have the workers to take those jobs anyway. So I'm not sure that manufacturing could come back, even if they wanted to. Trump's immigration policy is only going to make that worse. The people that would take the jobs making toasters are, in many cases, going to be immigrants. But if we end up deporting them or not letting them in, we're just telling companies, don't bother to come here because you're not going to be able to find the workers you need. I think the other thing that the Harris response, in part to what you said, is there are jobs and there are jobs. They're not all created equal. And there are other factors in the economy that matter when you make these calculations. And in her case, I think she would argue, or the Democrats in general would argue, that decarbonization and saving the climate is a relevant goal. And it's a goal that matters not just in some sort of obscure or abstract moral sense. It's a goal that matters in an economic sense. The climate change is going to cost us a lot going forward in floods, in tornadoes, in weather disasters that affect public health, that affect jobs, that affect transportation, that affect education, and affect a whole lot of other elements of our society. And that there's some changes we need to make in the structure of our economy in the interest of our future. And that I've waged a 3-year battle with them on one element of this, because for the first 2 years, they would say, we can do all that and it won't cost anymore. And I've been trying to convince them, and I think have convinced them, that yes, it will cost more. And we've talked about that in the podcast.
Well, you're right about that. And this is why I brought up Germany as the illustration. They actually did this.
Well, okay. Yeah, but they made some mistakes, like getting rid of nuclear.
Yes,
it was a huge mistake. But I think what the Harris people are now, or the Biden people are now saying is, yeah, it will cost more, but it's worth it. Because there are other values in the society like supply chain resilience, supply chain security that matters, and that's going to cost more. So I think what Harris is about is let's take care of the old industries that we've got. Let's give them a push. She was reaffirmed her opposition to selling U.S. steel, for example, but actually with a non-economic rationale. She said that, she just thinks the steel should be made by Americans, which kind of ignores the fact that no matter who owns the company, it'll still be made by Americans because the workers are going to be American. We're not going to be importing Japanese steel makers. But in any event.
And it was Buy America restriction in part that have shorted the market for steel in the United States and pushed up prices. That's what made Nippon Steel interested in the first place.
And, we'll see how that plays out. But I think what's interesting to me about her proposals are they're not just trying to restore or preserve the past. They're also trying to redesign the future in a way that deals with future crises like climate that are going to have an economic impact.
Well, I hope she has political advisors that have looked at what happened to Olaf Scholz's ratings as chancellor as those policies rolled out. Last I saw, he was like at 60% approval.
Yes, well, yeah, that's a combination of many things, and I'm not defending.
It's never one thing, but you want to avoid that if you want to pursue a policy like this. I'm saying.
Yeah, but I think they haven't framed it. Neither one of them is framing it this way, but at some point they should, and that is, I think what we elect presidents for really is to leave the country in better hands at the end of their time than it was in the beginning of their time. And what that means is, what are we doing for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? Trump is focused on what am I going to do for the workers of today? And that may get him elected because it's the workers of today that vote. Their children, well, some of their children will vote, but their grandchildren aren't going to vote because they're not old enough. But the real test of the president, I think, is, are you leaving the country better off for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren going forward? Trump's proposals don't do that. Trump's proposals purport to take care of current workers. I'm not even sure they'll do that, but they do nothing for second, third generations down the road. And I give Harris credit for at least trying to grapple with that problem.
Let me ask you both. We keep hearing from each side and from all sides of the media that, neither candidate is really talking about the issues. Do you believe that? We're sitting here talking about the issues and you guys know what they are talking about, but we keep hearing they're not talking about the issues. Are they?
I think they are. I mean, we're getting there. That was a big theme when Harris first took over the presidential candidacy. which I thought was a little bit unfair because she wasn't expecting this, and she needed time to develop proposals. The thing that she released earlier this week was an 80-page position statement on the economy, which Scott talked about. I think we're getting there. I think they both have presentational flaws. She's not always specific about precisely what she's going to do. Trump is also not very specific about what he's going to do. And he's also confusing in that, every 3 or 4 days he has something new or something different that he's going to do. He can't even settle on the amount of tariffs that he wants to charge, leaving aside the fact that any of the amounts is a terrible idea, but he's created enormous amounts of policy uncertainty. There was a Bloomberg report this week talking about now, I think it's up to 1/3 of American investors are saying they're just not going to make any decisions at all until they see the outcome of the election. And I think that if he's the president, you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I think, look, there are issues with both candidates. Yes, former President Trump says mean things about the press. Vice President Harris won't talk to him. She seems to avoid them. Okay. Now, I don't know which is worse. If you're the press, I don't know why you were so angry with Donald Trump when his competitor won't sit down and do interviews.
Well, she sat down. You had one yesterday.
That's one.
Well, that's one yesterday. That was the second one. We'll see if she has more.
Yeah. Look, I think more would be good. And Andrew, I think that's what's causing that concern to be raised about have we created it. There are some things we haven't talked about at all. For instance, whether we're approaching a debt crisis and the amount of federal spending. Look, the federal government's total outlays in 2019, that's not that long ago, 2019, were a little over $4 trillion. This year, they're going to be $7 trillion in outlays. What are we spending the money on? And the thing is, there's no fiscal conservatives in the race. There's nobody who cares about debt and deficits anymore, apparently. Nobody has asked a question about it. So we've had two debates.
And
we're all pretending like it doesn't exist.
No, but wait a minute. I'm glad you brought that up because the data that's come out, the estimates have come out this week, that if you look at Trump's proposals, and it's a range because it's, as I said, his proposals are all over the map, but the estimate is that his proposals will increase the national debt between $3.6 and $6.6 trillion over 10 years. The Harris estimate for what she's proposed, also a range, because she's not been that specific, are that she can reduce it between, I think, $600 billion or increasing it up to $1.4 trillion, also over 10 years. So with Harris, there's actually a chance that things will get better. I'm in the reduce the debt camp.
If you get the higher taxes and you get the economic growth despite the higher taxes.
Well, do you have a better way to reduce the debt than higher taxes?
Well, economic growth would be one.
There's no free lunch.
But there is no free lunch, and I agree with you, Bill, and nobody's talking about it. That's one thing that we haven't bothered to cover in this particular campaign.
Here's the thing. The campaigns should let the trade guys moderate a presidential debate. Then we would hear about the issues.
We'd at least ask follow-up questions.
Yeah. Yes, but we would ask questions they wouldn't want to talk about.
Right. That's right.
All right, guys, we've got a couple minutes for one other issue near and dear to our hearts. Can you give us a quick overview of the new proposed bans on Chinese and Russian vehicle technology? This feels pretty big, too.
Yes, they rolled that one out September 23rd, I think, and said, credibly, I think, that this was a national security decision, not an economic one. I think they're right about that. Essentially, what they've done is to ban the importation of hardware and software for connected electric vehicles. And to be a little more specific about that, the ban applies to two systems, vehicle connectivity systems, or VCS, and automated driving systems, or ADS systems, that are developed, manufactured, or supplied by entities that have ties either to China or Russia, which really means, in this case, primarily China. The ADS, the automated driving system ban, is really preemptive because we don't have a lot of autonomous vehicles driving around the country. We have some tests going on, including some Chinese companies that have been authorized to test, but we don't really have a market in those yet. So the idea is, on that one, is to get ahead of the curve. The vehicle connectivity system, we do have lots of connected vehicles in the country. And so it's a clear and present issue. The rationale is very similar to the rationale that's been provided for TikTok and the TikTok ban, in the sense that there are two concerns. One is data security, that if your vehicle is connected to the internet and connected via Chinese software, that the Chinese will be accumulating all your data, which means location data, but also any other data that might be going into your automobile, also via your phone. For example, if you're recharging your phone in your automobile, the data in your phone is being transferred to your automobile, which in turn, the argument goes, is going to be transferred to the Chinese and can be used for some nefarious purpose. Same argument as in the case of TikTok. The other argument is a little bit different, which is basically the sabotage argument. If you've got Chinese software controlling your vehicle, the Chinese could at some point turn it all off nationwide, or, direct your cars to do strange things and crash into other cars. The TikTok case was more a question of using it to influence, particularly young people. Sabotage is a little bit more serious. If you're talking about vehicles, which ultimately might be in a situation where they, even if you're driving, could be controlled by somebody else, or could be turned off, in the middle of an interstate highway when you're going 75 miles an hour, that's worrisome. And I can see why people would be concerned about that. Reaction to this has been so far kind of favorable, to the extent that there's grumbling. It's mostly been about phase-in dates, which for the software are 2027, and for the hardware are, I think, either 2029 or 2030, depending on some factors. There are some car companies who are arguing that may not be enough time to get out of their existing software arrangements with Chinese companies. But the larger issue, and Scott may want to comment on this, or I hope he will, is it really is a decoupling issue. It really is a statement that we are not going to have Chinese cars, period. I mean, they already had the 100% tariff, but now we're just not going to have them. And we're not going to have cars that contain Chinese hardware, Chinese software. That is pretty clearly decoupling.
I would agree with that, Bill. And that is one of the problems. And decoupling is a problem because the auto industry is not a national industry. It's a global industry. Okay, every competitor who is succeeding in the marketplace is a global competitor. You mentioned Geely, which is a Chinese firm that owns Volvo and Polestar. And so many of the Chinese vehicles that are sold in the United States today are Polestars. They're not a lot of cars, but this is the degree of integration of the industry on a global level. The other thing is, I think definitions have got to be done very carefully, because honestly, cars have been connected since 1991. The California Air Resources Board mandated that all automobiles have onboard diagnostics to be sold in the state of California from 1991 on. This is George H.W. Bush's term in office. All right, so we have 30 years of connectivity, and where do you draw the line? What do you want to regulate here? I mean, I remember a few years back, that great Chinese company BMW, just kidding, it's a German company, got into great trouble with its customers in the United States when they made the seat heaters, the seat warmers, subject to subscription. In other words, if you didn't pay a subscription price, the car would be instructed to turn off the seat heaters and make them non-functional. And it was an outrage when people found out about it, but that's the degree of connectivity that is in probably every vehicle today. And so much like there were concerns about Huawei, its integration into telephone networks worldwide, mobile phone networks, we're going to have the same issue here. So what is the problem and how to define it so it can actually be managed by these global companies, I think is an important question. And I hope the comments will bring that to light. But you're right, Bill, about decoupling. Absolutely. This is what they're trying for. Whether they succeed or not, I don't know.
All right, guys. It's been a pleasure as always. I'm glad to be back, and we will be back next week with more Trade Guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.